Rurik Kietov has been a submarine commander for 20 years. In August 1962, he was in charge of one of 4 submarines that left Soviet territorial waters for the first time ever. They were carrying nuclear-armed torpedoes. Rurik knew nothing about the submarine's destination until it reached neutral waters.
We didn't know what was in this envelope. We opened it after leaving Kola Bay. We saw the route inside. Even now, I remember it. The coordinates are 220 degrees from Jan Mayen to Cuba.
Now Rurik Kietov is 82 years old. He was one of the youngest commanders at the time. Like all the other commanders, he had been told to use every weapon available in the event of a confrontation with the enemy.
I had been authorized to use either nuclear torpedoes or conventional ones. 1 nuclear torpedo and 20 conventional torpedoes is nothing to sneeze at, you know. That would amount to 3 torpedo salvos.
Meanwhile, the Cuban Missile Crisis was rapidly sliding into its darkest moment. When President John F. Kennedy was told about Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba, he decided to declare a naval blockade of the island.
All ships of any kind bound for Cuba, from whatever nation or port, will, if found to contain cargoes of offensive weapons, be turned back.
The so-called hawks among US top military commanders were trying to persuade Kennedy to wipe out Soviet missile sites in Cuba by delivering a first strike. The head of Strategic Air Command, Curtis LeMay, was the principal advocate of such a solution to the crisis.
LeMay's attitude was, if war's going to come, this is the best time, because we had superiority over the Soviets in terms of numbers. And LeMay, when he was asked what he would do at Cuba, you know what he said? He said, "I'll burn it." And he meant it. He meant it.
By late October, Cuba was ready to face enemy airstrikes. Special shelters had been built in Havana, and locals had been alerted to the need to start evacuating the city as soon as the signal came through.
We were in this trench when we saw American aircraft breaking into our airspace. We also saw American naval vessels approaching our country.
From this trench, a passage leads to what is in effect an underground town. The tunnels stretch over hundreds of meters. Several thousand people could find shelter here in the event of a nuclear attack.
These are the underground rooms. We can see the base of a periscope installed inside. 2 binoculars are nearby. Back then, they were on duty 24/7.
On October the 27th, 1962, the world was closer to a nuclear catastrophe than ever before. One of the Soviet submarines was fired at when it surfaced in the Saragossa Sea. The sub responded by putting a nuclear torpedo on full alert. At that moment, a crew member became aware of US seamen trying to establish contact with the vessel's captain.
Captain Savitsky brought the submarine to the surface again to look around and see what was going on. There was some confusion on board. As a result, the order to fire a nuclear prime torpedo was not given.
Following contact with the Americans, they stopped firing at the submarine. If the situation had dragged on for another 2 minutes, the nuclear torpedo in the first compartment would have been launched, marking a point of no return.
This is the torpedo compartment. There were 20 torpedoes, including a nuclear one, in this torpedo tube. These handles would have sent the air into the launcher, and this high-pressure air injection could fire a salvo of 1 nuclear or 5 conventional torpedoes.
October the 27th, 1962 was dubbed Black Saturday. That same day, there was another incident in Cuba. A US spy plane was flying over the island photographing Soviet rockets. It was shot down by the Soviet anti-air missile defense system.
They have the order and they obey the order. So they shut down the U-2. And this is the engine, or the main part of the engine of the U-2. The only victim of the 1962 crisis.
Alexander Sizov is one of the officers of the air defense unit that was ordered to destroy Target 33, the plane piloted by Rudolf Anderson. After it was brought down, Sizov and many other officers had been told to get ready for war.
As we waited for them to strike back, we sort of withdrew into ourselves. There was a complete silence. No talking and no emotions. Everybody was in anticipation of further events, without knowing how it all would work out.
At the last moment, when tensions had reached their peak, the Kremlin and the White House found a compromise. Khrushchev had responded to a US offer of security guarantees for Cuba by deciding to have the missiles dismantled. When the news reached the Cuban leader Fidel Castro, he flew into a rage. The decision had been taken behind his back. One of the most seasoned Soviet party leaders, Anastas Mikhayan, went to Havana for talks with Castro.
When the talks got underway, my father received a message from Moscow saying that my mother had died. My father was in no position to go back. The news had a visible effect on Castro. He showed a good deal of compassion for my father. He said he respected him for staying behind. And I'm sure this helped the talks.
The blockade of Cuba was lifted. An operation got underway to remove the Soviet missiles from the island. They were being loaded onto upper decks without disguising them in any way. The Americans saw that the Russians weren't fooling them. Those were not mock-ups of missiles, but real hardware. Nikita Khrushchev, meanwhile, gave himself credit for resolving the critical situation that had emerged in the wake of the Cuban Missile Crisis.
The direct threat of a world thermonuclear war, which has emerged in connection with the crisis in the area of the Caribbean Sea, has been diffused.
Those who were involved in that operation were awarded no medals or other distinctions. Khrushchev felt the Americans had not been duly impressed by the Soviet Union's military might. He focused his anger on the submariners. He accused them of cowardice because they had failed to reach Cuba, but there was no point in arguing with him.
In those years, even top military leaders couldn't approach Khrushchev unless they had to. He was impulsive. When you realize the snap of somebody's fingers will have you trampled underfoot, that was a dreadful experience.
Later, Captain Rurik Kietov and the captains of 3 other submarines experienced many humiliating moments. They weren't given their due for the fact that they had been able to keep their heads in a very difficult situation and hadn't resorted to their right to use nuclear weapons.
There was no thanks at all. But I'd rather not talk about it. I don't want to fray my nerves. The commanders had a very hard time. Yes, we were dragged through the mud. But what about our subordinates, including my crew? Do you think anybody ever thanked them for the 80-day mission?
Time seems to have come to a standstill here. Revolutionary posters and linen suspended from ropes showing through the windows. Plush American cabriolets are the best reminders of the so-called colonial era before the revolution. Drivers make a special point of avoiding any discussions with foreigners about Cuba's current policies.
No, don't talk about politics. Forget about it. No, forget about politics. No.
Okay, sir.
I live here in Cuba. You go back to Russia, but I live here.
Ernesto Fraga finds it quite difficult to run a private business and be a taxi driver for tourists in Cuba these days. Numerous bans within the country are only part of the story. An economic embargo on Cuba has been in effect for 50 years already. Less than 200 kilometers separate Cuba from the United States, but no US-made commodities can reach the island. Cubans are still proud of the benefits of the revolution despite the embargo and a difficult economic situation. A festive atmosphere is present in the streets of Havana all year round. The daughter of the former officer of the Cuban army, William Rakip, is about to get married. William shows old photos to his future son-in-law as he tells him about his family. One of them features an old friend, Alexander Markov, a Soviet pilot who took part in the events of the Cuban Missile Crisis. The two officers corresponded for years before the internet came to Cuba. Then they switched to Skype.
Alex, привет!
Hi, Alex. Alex, how you doing, man?
Hello, William. How's your family? How's life?
He's okay.
Mine is okay. How's your family?
We're okay. Come visit us sometime.
You know, Alex, I might come to Moscow soon.
Yeah, looking forward to seeing you in my home village.
Well, до свидания.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Today, the Caribbean or Cuban Missile Crisis computer game is popular among those who could be the sons of the real participants of the 1962 events. Now, with the help of computer graphics, it's possible to imagine how the events could have turned out if the Soviet Union and the US didn't find a compromise. The worst outcome possible, a nuclear apocalypse.
All this looks less realistic in a game than in real life. Had anything like that ever occurred in real life, there wouldn't have been us or video games.
Vladislav Chelishev is the winner of this tournament. Most of the contestants couldn't make it to the finals, but the game begins once again regardless. In real life, however, there is no such thing as a reset after nuclear disaster.